Politicians just decided to lock everyone in their homes for months until a vaccine was developed so that these politicians could shove the vaccine down everyone's throats so that Big Pharma could make some profits. Woody Harrelson alluded to this notion during his monologue for Saturday Night Live, which was praised by many on social media. It's December 10th, 2019. 57-year-old seafood vendor Wei Guishan starts feeling sick, thinking she maybe has a cold. 8 days later, Wei would be bedridden in a hospital in China. Many other Hunan seafood vendors in the region would also begin reporting to local hospitals with similar symptoms. Many doctors and experts are unsure about what these patients are dealing with, speculating that it might be pneumonia. Between December 27th and December 30th, doctors conclude that the patients have a form of severe acute respiratory syndrome, also known as SARS, and begin to suspect that this virus is contagious and start sharing information across social media apps like WeChat, encouraging people to warn their relatives to act with caution. The messages were noticed by someone in Taiwan, and the information was shared with infectious disease experts in Taiwan. By December 31st, the Hunan seafood market was shuttered and disinfected. Meanwhile, government officials in Taiwan begin to prepare for a potential pneumonia outbreak and start imposing restrictions on travel to and from mainland China. And now it's 2020. Between January 1st and January 3rd, Chinese doctors were reprimanded for alarming the public about a new, potentially contagious virus. One doctor, Dr. Li, was interrogated by local police, accused of disturbing the social order, and threatened with punishment if he did not stop. Dr. Li would eventually die from COVID on February 7th. It would later be reported that the Chinese government was very active in censoring discussion of the unknown disease on apps like WeChat. On January 5th, the World Health Organization reports of pneumonia of an unknown cause in Wuhan, advising against any travel restrictions. On January 10th, the first death of this virus would be reported in China. On January 11th, Chinese scientists sequenced genetics for the new virus. On January 13th, biotech and pharmaceutical company Moderna, along with the United States National Institute of Health, finalized a sequence for an mRNA vaccine against the new virus. Right now might be a good time to mention that mRNA technology had a long and complicated history leading up to this point, with contributions from many different scientists, with both private financing and taxpayer support, with government institutions both helping and stifling development along the way. This topic is probably worthy of its own video, but I thought it was worth mentioning since many people try to claim credit for mRNA technology. From individual scientists like Dr. Robert Malone to socialist knuckleheads who want to make it sound like that the technology was all thanks to government-funded research. On January 14th, the World Health Organization, based on reporting from China, says that authorities have found no evidence of human-to-human transmission. It might be worth noting that the World Health Organization is part of the United Nations. China has a long history of using institutions like the United Nations to launder their reputation and further their agenda. Even in a recent CNN article talking about a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and China's leader Xi Jinping, and how both parties are pretty fond of the United Nations, where the two have a track record of blocking motions, including against actors like North Korea.
Are you absolutely suck!
On January 20th, China would confirm human-to-human transmission. On January 23rd, China begins locking down Wuhan and other cities in Hubei. Within a few days, tens of millions of people in China would be forcefully quarantined. While these measures went beyond the World Health Organization's guidelines at the time, nobody really seemed bothered or alarmed by the lockdowns. On January 24th, President Trump praises Communist China for their handling of the virus and transparency. On January 31st, the United States would declare coronavirus to be a public health emergency. On February 2nd, the United States issues travel restrictions to and from China. On February 6th, a healthy 57-year-old manager in the semiconductor industry dies in Northern California. By April, the U.S. Center for Disease Control would suspect that this would be the first COVID death in the United States. On February 24th, President Trump tweets that the coronavirus is very under control, adding that the stock market is starting to look very good. On February 27th, after repurposing a new influenza test they were developing into a test that detects COVID, Seattle-based infectious disease expert Helen Chu and her team of researchers find a positive COVID test in a local teenager. Days later, Chu and her team are told by federal regulators to stop testing and that their repurposed test would not be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. By mid-March, many sources would report on how the United States was egregiously behind on testing due to red tape and bureaucracy. This sentiment would be echoed by Dr. Deborah Birx in her book, Silent Invasion. Way to go, guys. On March 7th, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo declares a state of emergency. On March 11th, the National Basketball Association suspends the 2020 season after Utah Jazz players Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell test positive for COVID. This was after Rudy Gobert had wiped his hands on media microphones during a press conference as a joke. Other major sports leagues would follow suit. On March 13th, President Trump would declare a national emergency. On March 16th, President Trump, along with Vice President Mike Pence and along with infectious disease experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, would announce their 15-day plan to slow the spread.
This afternoon, we're announcing new guidelines for every American to follow over the next 15 days. As we combat the virus, each and every one of us has a critical role to play.
Giving a variety of safety recommendations to the American public, including social distancing and business closures. Both Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx would later admit that they did not think that 15 days was enough time. The justification for this was to flatten the curve, so to speak, to spread the amount of infections over a long period of time to avoid too many infections within a short span. Partly an effort to relieve the burden on overwhelmed hospitals while medical supply chains could meet growing demand.
We're asking that same sense of community to come together and stand up against this virus. And if everybody in America does what we ask for over the next 15 days, we will see a dramatic difference.
President Trump was hoping to return to normal by Easter, which would have been April, although it was implied that the CDC's guidelines might be encouraged until July. The CDC's guidelines are adopted and enforced by many states throughout the country. On March 19th, GameStop, a large chain of retail stores known mostly for selling video games and video game merchandise, announces that they are staying open because they deem their services to be essential. The company is mocked and ridiculed for their stance, all while the American public seems to just go along with politicians determining which businesses and jobs and services are essential or not.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
On March 25th, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo issues an order mandating that nursing homes accept medically stable patients regardless of whether or not they are confirmed to have COVID.
Oh, SpaghettiOs!
This was reportedly done in effort to free up resources for hospitals in New York. On March 27th, President Trump signs the CARES Act, a law that promises to spend $2.2 trillion in hopes of providing economic relief for Americans and stimulating the economy. The law created the Paycheck Protection Program, increased unemployment benefits, and sent many Americans a check for $1,200. On March 29th, President Trump announces an extension of COVID guidelines until April 30th. So much for 15 days to slow the spread. Fauci himself claims that he and others convinced the president to extend the deadline. At the time, Trump supporters and allies, including Steve Bannon, reportedly applauded the decision to extend the guidelines. On April 1st, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis issues a stay-at-home order for 30 days, although seems to make broad exceptions. On April 3rd, the Center for Disease Control recommends wearing facial coverings in public, prompting many cities and states to require mask mandates in public by law. Masks were recommended at the time based on the notion that many people might have COVID and not know it, and that wearing the facial covering might help prevent the spread of COVID. Many Americans would mistake the masks as a shield against getting the virus. On April 15th, President Trump announces a new approach to handle the virus. On April 16th, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer orders that stores larger than 50,000 square feet not sell gardening supplies, saying that unless you are buying essential items, you should not be going to the store. On April 18th, it's reported that Los Angeles fills skate parks in Venice Beach with sand to prohibit gatherings. These sanded skate parks would eventually be used by dirt bikers. On April 20th, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp announces that Georgia will be lifting COVID restrictions on small businesses. President Trump was reportedly not happy with Governor Kemp's decision. By late April, anti-lockdown protests and demonstrations take place throughout the country, although many of the demonstrators seemed more interested in promoting their pet political cause, like opposing the new vaccine or showing support for President Trump, who happily led the way on encouraging lockdowns and restrictions and was also active in getting the vaccines fast-tracked. On May 8th, it's reported that primary schools in France will begin to reopen. Between April and September, industrialized countries begin to open up schools. While school closures would vary throughout the United States, many schools in the U.S. would face longer lockdowns and restrictions than much of the industrialized world. As late as 2022, the Chicago Teachers Union lobbied to maintain remote learning. American Federation of Teachers leader Randy Weingarten would publicly condemn attempts to reopen schools throughout 2020 and 2021. By 2023, Weingarten testified in front of Congress, insisting that she did all she could to reopen schools as soon as possible.
Okay, you expect me to believe that load of crap?
On May 15th, President Trump announces Operation Warp Speed, a bold mission to get a vaccine for COVID on the market by 2021. 2021, which would involve spending billions of dollars for government-mandated clinical trials for various vaccines and other treatments for COVID. Just 2 weeks earlier, reporters at the New York Times were skeptical about the endeavor. On May 18th, Moderna announces positive phase 1 results for the mRNA COVID vaccine. On May 25th, George Floyd is killed while being apprehended by Minneapolis police. Footage of the arrest goes viral on social media. American cities erupt with protests, riots, and demonstrations. The thing worth noting here is that many public health experts, along with politicians and people in political media, were exposed to having major double standards when it came to the protests. Many of the same people who were demanding that beaches and parks and restaurants and bars and theme parks and nightclubs be closed and expecting that people indefinitely forget about going out to a sporting event or a concert, all in effort to save lives, many of these same politicians and pundits and experts were now saying that it was okay for tens of thousands of people to come together in public to protest. Although, it is worth noting that some experts, including Dr. Anthony Fauci and the head of the Center for Disease Control, warned that the demonstrations might result in infection surges. On June 4th, the National Basketball Association announces that they will be continuing the 2020 season starting July 30th with a variety of restrictions. On June 23rd, Major League Baseball came to an agreement about a shortened season. Many sporting events and other live events would be featured in front of empty arenas with simulated crowds. By July, after temporarily rolling back a few restrictions, many states reimpose restrictions, notably business lockdowns and mask mandates. Other states, like South Dakota, take a different approach, as South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem would boast about how her state was open for business, paying lip service to freedom and personal responsibility, refusing to impose restrictions prior to the big annual motorcycle rally in Sturgis. The contrasting policies toward containing the virus would inspire many people to continue a centuries-old debate over which is more important, freedom or safety. On August 20th, Pfizer would announce positive results for their clinical trials for their mRNA vaccine. On September 25th, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis reportedly lifts restrictions on businesses throughout the state of Florida. On October 2nd, President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump both test positive for COVID. The president is treated with medicine that is not yet approved for the public by federal regulators. Apparently, what's not safe for American consumers is totally fine for the American president. On October 30th, Joe Biden promises to shut down the virus if elected president. On November 3rd, the United States concludes voting in the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden would be declared the presumed winner on November 7th. On November 13th, California Governor Gavin Newsom is spotted eating dinner at the French Laundry without a mask, breaking his own state-mandated COVID restrictions. Politicians across the country, including in other countries, would be exposed for violating the restrictions they imposed on their constituents. By mid-December, the Food and Drug Administration would grant emergency use authorization for the Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines. On December 27th, President Trump signs the Consolidated Appropriations Act, adding another $2.3 trillion in spending $900 billion of which was for economic relief and stimulus. And now we're at 2021. On January 20th, Joe Biden is sworn in as President of the United States. On January 28th, New York Attorney General Letitia James, a Democrat, issues a report that the Department of Health undercounted nursing home deaths by 50%. By February, we start to find out that vaccine rollout is not going as smoothly as planned, with stories of wasted vaccine doses due to restrictions on who was allowed to receive the vaccine, including stories of doctors facing legal consequences for offering soon-to-be expired doses to non-eligible patients. On March 4th, we would see more reports, including from sources like the New York Times, about how the Andrew Cuomo administration tried to hide nursing home deaths. All the praise that Governor Cuomo received during 2020 for his handling of COVID had aged like unrefrigerated milk by this point. This scene's from May of 2020 of Governor Andrew Cuomo goofing around with his brother, who happened to be a primetime anchor at CNN, sound like something out of a poorly written comedy movie. Governor Andrew Cuomo would eventually resign from office after allegations of sexual misconduct. On March 11th, President Joe Biden signs the American Rescue Plan, adding another $1.9 trillion in economic relief and stimulus. By May of 2021, President Joe Biden would talk about how he wanted to lift intellectual property protections on vaccines, which would accomplish nothing other than maybe discouraging pharmaceutical companies from developing life-saving products in the future.
That's just not smart.
Between June and July, amid disappointing vaccine numbers and rising COVID cases, President Joe Biden would throw social media companies under the bus, saying that they were getting people killed.
What an asshole!
Shutting down the virus is not going as planned. It's around this time that most of America begins to lift restrictions, notably lockdowns and mask mandates. Although, in parts of California, some establishments were still required by law to both impose mask mandates on top of vaccine mandates. Apparently, nobody recognized that this may undermine the messaging on vaccines by implying that wrapping cloth around your mouth adds significant protection beyond the vaccine. By September, President Joe Biden would try to use OSHA to impose nationwide vaccine mandates on workers. This effort would eventually get reversed by the Supreme Court. Anyway, I think this is a good place to stop, and I know I probably left out a lot of important information. There's also a lot of stuff that we still do not know for certain, but some people may be wondering, why make a video like this on this topic? I think it can be easy for people to forget about a lot of these details, especially considering that the pandemic was hyper-politicized since the beginning. It can be difficult for people to think objectively about how the pandemic and the political response played out. It seems like the further away we get from the pandemic and the lockdowns, the easier it is for hucksters and charlatans to imprint their own bullshit narrative on what actually happened. One narrative that I've noticed is this notion that politicians acting at the behest of Big Pharma. Woo! Politicians just decided to lock everyone in their homes for months until a vaccine was developed so that these politicians could shove the vaccine down everyone's throats so that Big Pharma could make some profits. Woody Harrelson alluded to this notion during his monologue for Saturday Night Live, which was praised by many on social media. I've seen others over the years argue that COVID was either fake or at least exaggerated. Also, that Big Pharma could make a few extra dollars off the vaccine. This would ignore the fact that vaccine companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson both saw a decline in profits in 2020, although you could easily say that both companies have since more than made up for the decline in profits. This narrative would also not explain how countries like communist China and Taiwan took different approaches to containing the virus. China imposed much harsher lockdowns than the United States and for far longer, all while blocking vaccines from American pharmaceutical companies, which has proven to be a disaster for China. It also means that Big Pharma did not make any profits in the Chinese market, at least not off the COVID vaccine. Taiwan, on the other hand, never locked down, and they saw some of the lowest infection rates in the industrialized world. One could argue that being an island nation helps in this respect, and perhaps it did. Taiwan also had the advantage of knowing that the virus was potentially contagious even weeks before the World Health Organization recognized that the virus was contagious, which allowed Taiwan to get ahead of the curve, especially when it came to testing. And even after being ahead of the curve, Taiwan still embraced vaccines, particularly the vaccines that were made by greedy pharmaceutical companies. Anyway, I don't claim to have all the answers, but from what I can tell, America's political leadership from both parties, including the president at the time, were and still are bumbling idiots who were hoping that COVID would just blow over and not be a big deal, all while the regulatory state made it difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to get products like tests, vaccines, and treatments to the market. And by the time reality hit our political leadership in the face, they were egregiously underprepared and acting on the advice of experts who were terrified that COVID could get out of control and potentially result in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of preventable deaths. Our political leadership resorted to drastic measures.